Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. They called Fort Redstone a place that either made you or broke you. The sun baked the parade ground and the smell of oil and sweat hung in the air. Avery stood in formation like everyone else, shoulders square, chin down, uniform neat. She looked like a recruit, but she moved like someone who had learned to keep a steady pulse. Around her, the others joked and shoved, testing boundaries, but Avery kept her focus. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her eyes scanned the line and landed on Mason. He was a sergeant by title and weight, a presence who filled a room just by stepping into it. Mason Reddick was loud in a way that masked uncertainty, a man who pushed people to hide his own fear of being outdone. He barked, he snapped, he made sure everyone knew the pecking order. Across the yard, Logan watched more than barked. Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce had a different kind of authority, quieter, reliable. When he walked past, guys straightened not from fear but respect. Naomi, Avery's friend, leaned in and mouthed something about the day's drills. Naomi's laugh was the kind that cut the tension, the kind that made the worst days bearable. Even in the heat she joked, but she didn't joke about Avery's aim. Naomi knew what Avery could do, and she treated it like a fact, not a miracle. The training at Redstone was tough. Runs before sunrise, weapons checks until your hands cramped, and one sergeant who took particular pleasure in pointing out weakness. Mason made a game of finding it. He singled people out, watched for mistakes, and when he found them he made sure everyone knew. That kind of pressure either pushed recruits into crack or made them harder. Avery had already learned to grind against it. She kept her rifle clean, her breathing steady, and her head down. But there was a current under the drills, a tension that didn't belong to routine. You could feel it in the way men glanced at each other when Mason walked away, in the half-smiles that hid real thoughts. Someone was trying to set the tone, to shape who got through and who got left behind. The first week revealed small cracks. A dropped magazine that was blamed on clumsiness. A target scored lower than it should have been and labeled as luck. Mason favored theatrics. He loved the moment when a recruit's confidence cracked. Avery watched him do it a few times and stored each moment like data. She didn't react outwardly. She didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead she learned where his attention drifted, how he treated those he respected and those he didn't, and she planned her next steps quietly. When the firing line opened that afternoon, the range felt like a new world, metal taste to the air, the hum of distant conversation, the rhythm of 1,000 small movements. Each shooter took position and the targets waited like patient judges. Avery set her rifle, fingers methodical, breath even, and thought of nothing but the distance and the sight. That was when the world narrowed, when everything else dimmed until there was only the barrel, the target, and her breath. It was a place her father had taught her to find. It was the place she trusted most. After her first 3 shots, murmurs moved through the line. That was the sound of attention landing on her like a weight. Someone whispered, "She's steady." Mason watched with an expression that was more calculation than surprise. Logan gave her a small nod that said, not loud enough to be noticed, "I see you." Naomi clapped when the last casing hit the dirt, silent and fierce. So the day ended with more than sweat on uniforms, it ended with a sense that something had started. A quiet promise threaded through Avery's chest, she wasn't here to prove him wrong. She was here to prove herself right. The next morning the yard felt different, like someone had tilted the world a fraction and everything slid into a new angle. Word about the shooting spread by sunrise. Fort Redstone is a small planet where every rumor is a satellite. Mason's face carried that hard edge pride wears when it thinks it's been betrayed. He called a full formation, took his time inspecting rifles like a man cataloging offenses, and he made sure the line watched every move. His inspections were theater, dramatic pauses, pointed looks, the kind of slow humiliation that's meant to be remembered. After that, Mason changed the rules without saying a word. He put her at the front of the obstacle course, assigned her the overnight guard shifts, and invented petty punishments with a creativity born of resentment. He loved the spectacle of a recruit folding under pressure. Some did. Others learned to hide bruises until they healed. Naomi kept her smile but sharpened it into a shield. Logan tried to mask his interventions, an offhand correction here, a careful step between Mason and Avery there, but he couldn't fix the atmosphere. The camp began to orbit Mason's temper. It was gravity for a week. Qualification week turned that pressure into something hard and public. The scoreboard went up and names became a map of belonging. Avery's rank should have stayed a fact, a number to be noted and moved past. Instead, Mason announced a requalification challenge, public, head-to-head, same rifles, same distances. Lucky shots don't make a marksman, he said so everyone could hear. The challenge was a gauntlet and it was meant to humiliate or to prove him right. But Avery read it for what it was, a chance to close the chapter that had been opened. They set the line side by side. Mason's rifle was polished and heavy with the look of ownership, Avery's hands were steady like a habit. The whistle cut the field and both breathed into the familiar ritual, breathe, settle the cheek, pick the dot, squeeze. The crowd shrank into silence as the first rounds cracked. Each shot measured a tiny argument between intention and recoil. When she fired, she did it with the cold patience she'd trained into her bones. When Mason fired, you could see his body trying to outrun the thing he'd done to himself, anger. When the last casing clicked, the targets told their truth. Avery's groupings were tighter, her shots ate the black with a rhythm that didn't waver. The yard exhaled in stages, first disbelief, then a few stifled congratulations, then a hush that felt like a new kind of attention. Mason's jaw moved, a slow animal reconsidering its hunger. He didn't shout or strike, he turned and walked off like a man whose map had lost a city. That silence after his retreat was not peace. It was a tense recalibration. People who'd watched him for years looked at him differently. People who'd watched her looked at her differently too. What followed was not instant glory. Mason tightened his grip in other ways. Paperwork suddenly mattered more, reports adjusted, credits delayed, a practice slot rescheduled that made training days bleed into nights. He used rules like a covert weapon. Some of the instructors saw it and frowned, but hierarchy is a thick shield, nobody wants to be the first to poke it. Logan kept supporting in small, nearly invisible ways, a ration of water handed quietly, a corrective word to an overzealous trainer, the kind of favors that kept a recruit human when systems start to grind. Avery absorbed it like winter hardens bone. She kept shooting, kept waking before dawn, kept cleaning her rifle until the metal looked new again. But tension breeds tests of another kind. Someone tampered with a practice score sheet and it read lower than the target showed. A shipment of ammunition arrived late. A whispered rumor suggested her success was a fluke bought with luck and not skill. The noises piled up until a new threat felt inevitable. Mason wanted a collapse he could claim as proof. She wanted to prove otherwise. That night she sat on the back step of the barracks, the field dimmed under a low moon, and Naomi slid down beside her. "You did good," Naomi said, no flourish. "You did what you came to do." Logan's shadow passed by at a distance and he nodded, careful. Avery held the rifle across her knees like a promise. The calm didn't last. By morning, orders shifted and a notice went up, a public range challenge at Arlington Tactical Range. It was official, hard to dodge, and everyone on base would be there to watch. Mason had picked the next stage, and the field had widened. News of the Arlington challenge brought people from other units, a few civilian observers, and a cold clarity that this was no longer just about one sergeant's pride. The line at Arlington was bigger, the targets farther, and the crowd thicker, faces that wanted a spectacle, faces that wanted confirmation. Avery felt it all settle on her like weather. She woke earlier than usual, cleaned her gear until the metal shone, and went through the same slow ritual: breath, cheek, sight, press. Routine steadied the storm. Mason's presence was louder than ever. He moved through the crowd like a storm front, eyes scanning and landing with intent. He'd timed everything so the spotlight would be his if Avery faltered. He'd seeded doubt in small ways. An officer told a passing joke about luck, an old-timer muttered that the kid had only one good day. It was the slow erosion technique: make the ground feel unfamiliar and someone will trip. But there were other moves beneath the surface. Scores were questioned. Ammo allotments were misplaced before practice. A maintenance log showed weapons serviced on the wrong day. At first it read like incompetence. Then patterns emerged. Logan tried to be visible but careful: escort in the range, a word to officials, a placement near the scoreboard to keep an eye on things. Naomi stayed close and loud in her support. She joked to break tension and, when it mattered, she was the one to hand Avery a fresh pack of rounds without fanfare. But not everything could be solved by camaraderie. Some battles were administrative, and the administration favored those who knew how to bury things under paper. That's where Jonah came in. Jonah Pratt wasn't loud. He was a specialist in logistics and maintenance and had an eye for numbers and schedules that felt more like instinct than training. He started to dig quietly, cross-referencing shipment manifests with supply room logs, checking timestamps on maintenance entries, comparing serial numbers. What he found didn't look like simple forgetfulness. Someone had altered records to create small delays and random discrepancies, the kind that could be explained away but only if no one looked closely enough. Jonah slid his notes to Logan with a line that said, "Not clean." Logan read it, folded it, and kept it in his pocket like a loaded card. The day of the challenge, rain flirted with the range, which added a new variable most shooters hate: unpredictability. They doubled the distances. Mason upped his rhetoric. He wanted a decisive narrative, not just a win, but a public humiliation that would erase chatter. Avery felt the pressure physically, a tightening in her shoulders, a dry spot in her throat. She channeled it into focus. Each shot was a small decision, an agreement between intention and physics. For a while, it worked. Her groupings were tight. The crowd leaned in on the long shots, and a few people who had doubted her shifted their posture into surprise. Then came the third series. A crosswind picked up, and one of Mason's crewmen shouted about a gust that wasn't supposed to be there. A second later, an official called a discrepancy at one of the scoring booths, data not matching the target scans. The judges paused. Mason's eyebrows lifted like a conductor waiting for his cue. The silence stretched thin like wire. Jonah's notes suddenly mattered more than any cheer. Logan stepped forward, presented the evidence: shipment timestamps, altered entries, a maintenance technician's log that had been edited at odd hours. The officials had to look. They had to act. Chaos doesn't come neat, it comes noisy and human. People shouted, some defended a sergeant they respected, others wanted the truth. Mason barked orders, but his voice had a new edge, frustration threaded with fear. The officials called a halt to the event until the discrepancies were cleared. That pause was both relief and new danger. Moss of power shifts happens in pauses, someone always tries to move pieces. What followed were choices. Logan could push, making accusations that would force a formal inquiry and possibly ruin careers, including his if it backfired. Jonah could keep the notes private and warn Avery to slip away before things got worse. Naomi could step forward publicly and tell what she'd seen, risking backlash. Avery could demand the formal test be rerun under neutral oversight or accept delays and hope truth moved slow enough to protect her. They chose to collect, not confront. They secured a witness list, logged every inconsistency, and smuggled a copy of Jonah's findings to a DoD liaison, Rowan Keller, someone whose badge meant different kinds of doors opened. That night the barracks hummed with a different electricity. Some said they'd seen Mason in the commander's tent, talking in low tones with officers who'd nodded seriously. Others said the paperwork had already begun to disappear. Avery didn't sleep much. She sat with the rifle across her knees and thought about the simple lines of a target. The next days would be about more than marksmanship. They'd be about exposure, about choices that either made you safer or more visible. In the morning, she'd have to decide how much she'd fight in public, how much she'd let others carry her story, and when to pull the trigger on truth instead of lead. That morning the choice was no longer theoretical. Avery sat in the back of a black SUV with Jonah across from her, both of them listening to Rowan give last-minute instructions through a headset. Logan rode two vehicles back, quiet and steady. Naomi moved like she always did, focused, ready to turn a joke into a distraction if needed. The plan was simple on paper: infiltrate Mount Sterling Black site, access the core server, pull unfiltered logs of Phantom Directive operations, and exfiltrate before anyone could react. Real operations are rarely simple on paper. Mount Sterling looked like any industrial facility from a distance: concrete walls, guard towers, a service road. Up close it had the smell of diesel and the kind of silence trained men keep when they don't want words to be overheard. They moved at night. Jonah handled the bypass on the biometric lock while Rowan kept watch on radio chatter. Avery felt the rifle against her hip like a second heartbeat. Every step toward that door felt heavy with consequence. They weren't there to win a fight. They were there to prove there had been a fight worth reporting. Inside, the site was colder than expected. Servers hummed with a mechanical certainty that made silence feel dangerous. Jonah worked like a man disarming a bomb, fingers moving fast, eyes darting across lines of code. He laughed once, short and surprised, when a breadcrumb of files opened that confirmed the worst suspicions: operation logs, contractor payments, lists of targeted individuals, surveillance footage. It was worse than they had feared. Names were there, signatures, timestamps. There was Mason's file with a clear trail of manipulations back to Halstead. There was a folder of directives with locations and dates that matched the missing reports Logan had suspected. They had the proof. For a moment everything was a quiet, grinding victory. Then the lights clicked on. "Don't move," a voice said behind them. It was cold, controlled. The room filled with armed men stepping out of shadow. Mason stood at the doorway, rifle leveled but not firing, a look on his face that mixed regret and resolve. Behind him came other faces Avery knew from the base and faces she didn't: contractors, operatives with no unit patches. At the far end of the server room Colonel Halstead stood as if he belonged there by right, his presence like a dark crown. "You picked the wrong night," Halstead said without stepping forward. He spoke in a tone that expected a reply, as if entrapment were a conversation. Rowan stepped out, hands up, and for the first time looked as tired as Avery felt. "You don't have to do this, Colonel," Rowan said. "You can stop it now." Halstead's mouth twitched. "I stopped a lot of things, Agent. The world doesn't care about clean hands. It cares about results." Avery swallowed. There was a half-second when options scattered across her mind: run, fight, bargain. Jonah slid a thumb drive into his pocket and gave her a look that said what words couldn't: trust the extraction. Naomi, always the one with the loud laugh, gave a small, steel nod. Logan's jaw was set so tight it looked like it bled. Mason's eyes caught hers and in them she saw the old man who'd snapped pride into a rifle and the man who'd sold himself to a system promising control. For the fifth time, the humanity and the betrayal met in the same look. Halstead made a casual motion and operatives closed ranks. "You can make this easy," he offered. "Walk away. Forget what you saw. Your careers, your lives, small price for continuity." The offer was poison. It wanted to seduce by promise of safety but it reeked of cowardice. Avery thought about Naomi's laugh, about Logan's steady hand, about Jonah's notes, about every kid at Fort Redstone who'd been pushed by a man who needed to be right. She also thought about the files glowing in Jonah's laptop, a map of corruption that would burn if released. Make it hard, she said instead. Halstead smiled like someone who'd heard that before and dismissed it by snapping a radio command. Guns rose. The world narrowed to the point of a muzzle and the taste of iron anxiety. They moved with training, with survival instincts sharpened by nights of readiness. Rowan and Jonah dove for cover. Naomi pushed a server rack as a shield. Logan returned fire and the room became a machine of movement and noise. Avery didn't aim at faces. She aimed at the gap between door and wall, at the hinge that would buy them seconds. She fired to disable, not kill, because what she wanted was proof, not bodies. The exchange was brief but brutal. The operatives were professionals, quick to respond, and the room filled with smoke and the echo of commands. Jonah yelled that the uplink was ready. He had wired the drive to stream to multiple drops, news outlets, watchdog sites, secure lanes Rowan trusted. They had built redundancy into desperation. When Jonah hit send, the server began to pour files outward, a silent scream traveling across networks. Halstead cursed, an ugly sound, and his men surged to cut the lines. In the chaos Mason hesitated, then suddenly lunged not at Avery but at one of Halstead's operators. For a breath there was confusion. Why would he help them? And then Avery understood. Some lines, once crossed, change people. Mason's break had been from pride to ownership of guilt. He chose, in that moment, to undo what he had been made to do. The extraction became a scramble. They ran through smoke, boots slapping concrete, alarms wailing like an outraged animal. Logan covered the rear, bringing down 2 pursuers. Rowan guided them to a side exit, to a path where the SUV waited with Naomi behind the wheel. Jonah limped in, one hand bleeding but grinning like an idiot. Sent it, he panted. Sent to all the right places. They drove through a night that felt like a mouth closing on a secret. Behind them the base lit up with emergency lights. Halstead's men cursed and called names. The files were out. The consequences would be immediate and tidal. Avery felt a new kind of exhaustion, one that came from choosing truth and surviving it. They reached Raleigh's safe house just after dawn. For a long minute none of them spoke. Rowan checked feeds and began to catalog hits. The first news outlets pinged back, watchdogs responded, secure channels acknowledged receipt. It was messy and it was beautiful and it was dangerous. You did it, Naomi said quietly, voice ragged. Avery looked at the drive Jonah still held like a talisman. We did it, she answered. But the victory tasted thin. They had exposed a shadow, but shadows call for dark hands. The climb out of what they'd started would be harder than getting in. Halstead would not surrender easily, and Mason's choice didn't undo the lives already taken. For now they had truth. In the morning the world would decide what to do with it. The sun rose over Raleigh like it hadn't heard a thing, ordinary and blind to the chaos that had been unleashed overnight. But screens didn't sleep. By dawn the feeds lit up with the first headlines, small at first, then swelling into a roar, leaked files, covert operations, unnamed sources. The drive Jonah sent had done what they hoped and what they feared. It was everywhere at once, newsrooms, watchdog inboxes, analysts in tidy suits whispering into phones. For a moment it felt like the truth finally had momentum. They watched it unfold from the safe house living room, the television a loop of cautious reporters and expert panels. Rowan sat at the laptop, his fingers flying through secure channels, patching them into contacts at oversight committees and sympathetic journalists. Logan brewed coffee without looking at anyone, the gesture more about staying busy than thirst. Naomi kept checking windows, a habit of someone who'd learned that danger often arrives in small, human footsteps. Jonah replayed pieces of code like a man double-checking a lock that might fail. Avery sat with her rifle case closed at her feet, the metal a weight that grounded her more than a pillow ever could. At first the reaction was promising. Investigations were announced, senior officers called in for questioning, and a few contractors named in the files were put on administrative leave. Halstead's name made a cameo on a morning briefing. The department put out a statement that sounded like a shield, patriotic, vague, promising, thorough review. But the statement also hinted at caution: not all leaks are true, and some documents can be manipulated. The pushback had started, subtle at first: denials, tiny corrections, op-eds about security and the need for discretion. The initial victories were real but fragile. People who'd been discredited for trying to speak up found new ears, but the institution moved like an ocean liner. It corrected slowly and sometimes shifted back. Meanwhile, Halstead didn't fall right away. Instead he circled, gathering allies, working channels that weren't public. The leaked files were a wildfire, but Halstead had water taps closer to the source. He began to leak counter-narratives through other nodes, playlists of ambiguity and friction. He questioned provenance, emphasized national security, and suggested the need for internal handling. That's when the cost of exposure became clear. Forces that preferred shadow to sunlight don't fade quietly. Friends lost jobs because they'd been seen with Rowan or because their names were on peripheral lists. Jonah found his clearance flagged, minor discrepancies from years ago returned like curses. Logan was reassigned to training duty far from investigations, a protective move he took as punishment. Naomi got threats, anonymous calls, a paper slid under her door. Avery received a private message with a cropped photo of her family home and a number she didn't recognize. The leaks had lit a path, and that path led straight into people's lives. The press made a hero out of a silhouette and a code name, but inside the safe house they knew the story was messy. Truth didn't always translate to safety. It pushed. It exposed. It also made targets out of those who'd been trying to help. The team argued less about whether they'd done the right thing and more about how to survive doing it. Rowan had contingency plans. He had contacts, safe routes, legal pads full of names who might help. But contingency plans are only as good as the people who follow them. Then came the subpoena. An oversight committee called for an independent inquiry and summoned testimonies. That should have been a win, an official forum to present proof. But it also meant stepping into light, testifying under oath with Halstead's lawyers circling like predators. The question wasn't whether the documents were real, the question was whether the witnesses could withstand pressure, smear, and legal traps. They rehearsed testimony in the basement of the safe house until voices were hoarse. Logan practiced answers that wouldn't put others at risk. Jonah memorized the chain of custody in case someone tried to break it. Naomi learned to keep her face steady. Avery practiced telling the truth without letting anger slip into words. On the day they went to testify, the halls smelled like bleach and confidence. The hearing room was packed, officials, reporters, counsel, and that enemy of light sense that someone had an entire playbook for damage control. Rowan presented the chain of evidence with a clear voice, careful and sharp. Jonah, despite trembling hands, explained the technical trail. Naomi's statement was short and human. She told a simple truth about seeing manipulated logs and late shipments. Logan's testimony came across as quiet and measured, nothing theatrical, but it landed. Avery waited until the end. She stepped up and told the story plainly: the broken rifle, the humiliation, the silent work, the break-in, and the files that followed. She didn't play the martyr or the hero, she described the chain of events and the consequences. The committee's cameras and questions were a pressure cooker. Halstead's legal team tried to poke holes, to cast doubt on motives, to suggest career grudges. They asked about timing and access. They asked why a private would take such risks. Rowan's answers were precise. Jonah's technical depth kept the room honest in a few critical moments. The process bruised them, long hours, sharp questions, but it also revealed fractures in Halstead's armor. Small inconsistencies in his defenders' stories leaked like seams. After days of testimony, the committee recessed and called for a temporary suspension of certain program activities pending full investigation. It wasn't victory, but it was leverage. The news cycle pivoted, and public opinion began to demand transparency. People who had shrugged off whispers now asked questions. That momentum put protective light on some of them and made others more exposed. Avery understood that the legal world was a battlefield of attrition. You didn't always win outright, you wore away opposition. In the quiet between hearings, they made hard choices. Some of the team went into witness protection temporarily. Naomi took a leave and left Fort Redstone to move in with a cousin out of state. Jonah accepted a transfer and a long shadow of bureaucracy. Logan resigned his commission instead of being reassigned, choosing a life where he could watch over people without the weight of an institution that broke him. Rowan stayed, taking a job that kept him close to the case and farther from flashy headlines. Avery decided not to go back to Fort Redstone, not yet. She felt the pull of other missions, other ways to keep aiming without being a sitting target. The leaks had changed things. Phantom directive units were on ice for the moment, investigations were underway, and Halstead's influence had been checked. But everyone knew it was a pause, not an ending. Dark systems adapt. People had been hurt. Families had been threatened. The moral clarity of exposure had come with messy, human costs. Avery sat on the porch of the safe house at dusk, watching the horizon and feeling both the relief of a wound that had been opened to heal and the ache of knowing how much more work waited. She could feel the change in the air like a season shifting, less calm, but with the sharpness of opportunity. The fight wasn't over. It had simply moved to another field. Morning after morning the headlines cooled into policy debates, and committees that once moved slowly now published memos, redactions, and recommendations. Halstead was under formal investigation, his access cut, his public statements measured and defensive. Some of his people were indicted, others quietly reassigned, and a few disappeared into private contracts where oversight was thin and the stories were easy to bury. It wasn't clean, nothing like that ever is, but the pressure had real teeth now. The leak had started a machine that would chew for months, maybe years, and it had changed the rules of the game. Avery watched most of it from a distance. She stayed in Raleigh longer than expected, partly because the easy assumption was that the safest place was the place no one expected her to be. Rowan handled most of the legal routing and press channels. His voice on calls was always exact, tired but sharp. He kept the group tethered to the truth like a rope through a storm. Jonah rebuilt his life one firewall at a time, doing contract work for agencies who wanted someone who knew how their systems bent. Naomi moved north with a cousin and started a job where no one knew Fort Redstone's gossip. Logan, who had left active duty, taught marksmanship at a community center and pulled veterans into support programs. Each of them tried to stitch ordinary days back into their lives, but ordinary felt different now, more fragile, and more important. Fort Redstone changed too. The base brought in new oversight officers, rotated leadership, and ran audits that lasted weeks. Training was louder in some places and quieter in others. Some instructors found themselves under review, others left voluntarily. The recruits who stayed watched and learned in a climate where questions were safer. Mason's absence left an empty place that people either avoided looking at or filled awkwardly. There were rumors about him. Some said he'd been detained, others that he'd fled the country. The truth was messy. Pieces of his cooperation showed up in reports that saved some careers and ruined others. He'd done something he couldn't completely walk back from, and in doing so he'd become a complicated footnote in a story that didn't have clean villains. Avery did not return to the same line she'd stood in before. Returning felt like stepping into a photograph of an old life you could not inhabit again. Instead she found other ways to aim. She began teaching in small, practical ways, volunteer classes for young veterans and community members, lessons that started with breathing and ended with responsibility. She told them about fundamentals and discipline and, sparingly, about consequences. She never dramatized her story. She told it as one thing after another, what happened, what she did, why truth mattered. Some of those she taught would become trainers, some would return to service, and some would go on to lives far removed from barracks and ranges. The important thing, she felt, was that someone learned the difference between obedience and loyalty, between orders and conscience. There were darker nights too. Threats kept coming for a while, anonymous messages, a car that stalled a block away, someone at Naomi's old apartment door. But the public exposure had changed the calculus for those who might move in the shadows. There were too many eyes now, press, oversight committees, public watchdogs, and reckless moves would be visible in ways they hadn't been before. That didn't mean danger vanished. It only meant it would need to be smarter and costlier to execute. That reality gave the group a fragile measure of safety and a larger responsibility to keep pressing. Months later, the department announced reforms, tighter contractor vetting, clearer chains of responsibility, and enhanced whistleblower protections. Drafts of policy looked good in press releases. Implementation was the slow part, the part that would take continuous, practical pressure. Rowan stayed in the orbit of oversight, moving between briefings and secure hearings, while Jonah worked on hardened systems that would log everything and make tampering harder. Naomi got a small award for civic courage. She laughed when it happened and said she'd rather have coffee with old friends than a plaque. Logan's program at the community center grew into a support hub that helped vets find jobs and stability. They found ways to redirect the burst of attention into something lasting. Avery kept shooting. She still went out to the ranges in the mornings, sometimes alone, sometimes with a small group of recruits who wanted to learn a steady hand without the ego that once poisoned training grounds. She taught them to respect the weapon, not as an equal or enemy, but as an instrument that responded to discipline. Her hands were steady, not because the rifle had ever cared for her, but because she had learned to care for herself. She told stories about aim and about consequences, and she watched faces change in the light of what she said. Once, months after the leak, she received a letter from a sergeant at a small base in the Midwest. It was short: "Thanks for the training tips, the unit's morale improved, their scores were up, and they were asking better questions." The note ended with a line that caught her more than it should have: "You reminded us that we can be better." She folded the letter and kept it in a locker with the rifle that had started it all. The metal there was dented still, proof a thing could break and still be useful. There were no trophies, no parades. There were hearings that would continue, papers that would bury and reveal, legal battles that would make people weary. But there was also an unmistakable shift: people who had been forced into silence found ways to speak, and systems that had been allowed to hide were forced into daylight. Truth had costs, but secrecy carried a heavier toll for everyone involved. Avery accepted that the fight had become quieter, but not less necessary. She would keep aiming, teach others to do the same, and hold a space where honor meant something beyond obedience. On a cool evening she stood at the edge of an empty range, the sun low, and watched a young recruit set up. He moved with the nervous carefulness of someone who still had much to learn. Avery walked over, placed her hand on his shoulder, and said, plain as the horizon, "Remember why you aim." He nodded, breathed in, and the day narrowed to the space between sight and target. The shot rang out, clean and honest. Avery let herself feel a small, steady kind of pride. Not because she had won anything monumental, but because something in the world had shifted toward better light. She closed the rifle case and walked back toward the barracks, not to sleep, but to keep going. The story had ended one chapter, another had begun, and in that continuation lay the real work.